What's up everyone, Erik here and welcome to Hardware for Gamers. In this video we'll be taking a look at one of Cooler Master's best-selling products, the Hyper 212 Evo. Let's take a closer look. Now I'm going to start off by quickly going over the Hyper 212's lineup on Cooler Master's website. Now I'm not sure how many of these are still being sold, but by my count there are 10 different coolers that were or are being sold under the Hyper 212 name. Now the cooler I have is the Hyper 212 Evo, so try not to get it confused with the Hyper 212 Evo V2 or the Hyper 212 Black or the Hyper 212X or the Hyper 212 LED Turbo, and there are a few others as well. And there are differences between these coolers too. Like the Hyper 212 LED has a different heat pipe alignment than the Hyper 212 Evo does. Not to mention the mounting hardware for the coolers are completely different as well, which could lead to a more substantial temperature difference than any of the other differences between these two coolers. So the point I'm trying to get to is the performance of all these Hyper 212s are not going to be the same. Now by how much, I'm not really sure. And the issue that I see here is the average consumer is not going to realize that there is a difference. They're just going to go watch and or read some reviews on one of the coolers and then possibly buy a different cooler, thinking that the only difference is that this cooler's fan has some LED lights on it, but that's not going to be the case, or not necessarily going to be the case. Okay, with that rant finally being over, the Hyper 212 Evo sells for $45 US, but can often be found on sale for as low as $35 US. Now let's take a look at what comes in the box. So there is a smaller box in the box that has all the mounting hardware in it. Then there is the heatsink and fan, which comes in a plastic packing. And there is an included backplate on the backside of this plastic packaging. Taking the heatsink and fan out of the packaging. So the cold plate does not have the thermal compound pre-applied. There is just the protective sticker on it. Now opening up the small little box, there is an extra set of fan brackets, so if you want to try a push-pull setup, you can. And there is the rest of the mounting hardware and a small tube of thermal compound. There are also some folded sheets of paper, one being the user manual, and the other being the warranty information. Now let's take a closer look at the fan and heatsink. The fins on the heatsink are aluminum. There are 4 copper heat pipes. These heat pipes are continuous direct contact heat pipes with a diameter of 6 millimeters. Now looking at the cold plate, you can see the direct contact copper heat pipes that are fitted into a block of aluminum. This block of aluminum is what holds the X bracket mounting system. This cooler comes with one PWM fan. The box indicates the fan has a rated RPM between 600 and 2000, and we'll check on that in a little bit. The Hyper 212 Evo does not use the metal clips. Rather, it has a set of plastic brackets that get screwed into the fan. The dimensions of the Hyper 212 Evo with the fan attached is 158 millimeters high by 120 millimeters wide by 77 millimeters deep. Now, based off of these dimensions, I don't think anyone should have any RAM clearance issues for a micro ATX or ATX build. Now for an ITX build, I think you'd typically run into a height clearance issue before running into any RAM clearance issues. Okay, the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo is compatible with, I think, every Intel socket going back to 1366, and that is including the high-end desktop sockets as well. Now for the AMD compatibility, all mainstream sockets going back to AM2 are compatible, so the Threadripper sockets are not compatible. Now for the installation of the cooler onto a motherboard, and FYI, this is one of, if not the most annoying CPU cooler I have ever installed. Now as always, before you start, make sure that you have a flat, sturdy surface. You should also have a mat, preferably an anti-static mat, but in a pinch you can always use the box that your motherboard came in. And you will also need your own Phillips 2 screwdriver. I'll be demonstrating to you on an AM4 motherboard. Now the installation between mainstream Intel and AMD sockets are very similar. The differences being the screws and what holes the screws go through on the backplate. Now starting with the installation of the backplate, place the mounting screws through the cutouts on the motherboard and align the screw holes on the backplate. The easiest way to do this is to stand the motherboard up and do this one at a time. Once you have the screw through the correct screw hole of the backplate, fasten them using the provided nuts. I would recommend just finger tightening them at this point. Once you've done all four, place the motherboard socket up onto your mat. Find the socket screwdriver adapter and tighten all four standoffs. Now you definitely don't want to over tighten these standoffs. Doing so may damage your motherboard. Once the backplate is on, we can then begin installing the heatsink. Start by removing the fan. Pinch the clips back on one side of the fan, then pull that side of the fan away from the heatsink. Place the fan off to the side for now. Find the X bracket and adjust it to suit the motherboard socket. You do this by pulling the head of the screw and sliding the screw to the appropriate position. And this is where I start finding the installation to be very, very annoying, because you need to now fit the X bracket in between the heat pipes, making sure to match the pictures provided in the user manual, because I really don't know how to put that into proper words, so you're kind of on your own there. Once you have the X bracket positioned correctly, clean off your CPU with some isopropylene alcohol, then apply the provided or your own thermal compound to the CPU, making sure to remove the sticker from the bottom of the cold plate. Place the heatsink cold plate down onto the CPU's IHS, making sure to align the screw threads to the standoffs, tightening the screws in a cross-diagonal pattern. I find it easiest to make sure that all the screws were threaded into the standoffs before tightening the screws all the way down. I typically do 3 or 4 passes. Now you can reinstall the fan onto the heatsink and plug in the PWM connector to the CPU fan header on your motherboard, and you're done. Okay, now before moving on to the temperature testing, I just wanted to quickly go over the performance of the fan. So with the fan being at 100%, the RPM reading I got was 2010 with a dBA of 40.5. And again, that was taken from 20 inches away in an open air test bench. Now when I dropped the speed of the fan all the way down, the RPM reading I got was 690, and the dBA reading was at or below ambient of 32, which is the noise floor of my room. And again, before I get just directly into the temperature testing here, if you haven't watched my CPU cooler testing methodology video, I strongly suggest you do. It's where I go over the how and what of all the CPU cooler testing. I'll put a card above and I'll also link it in the description. And as usual, I'll be adding coolers to these charts as I test and review more CPU coolers. So the Hyper 212 Evo in the noise equalized 87 watt test performed as well as the Twin Tower Fantex cooler with a temperature of 76.5 Celsius. Now letting the fans run at full speed, the Hyper 212 Evo just barely overtook the much larger cooler with a temperature of 75.2. Now the Hyper 212 Evo was 3 dBA louder and there was less than a Celsius difference between the two coolers, but for the price, the Hyper 212 Evo did pretty well. Now the Hyper 212 Evo did not do very well in the 150 watt testing, where it failed both the noise equalized and the full speed tests. Now what I mean by failed is that the 3900 XT was thermally throttling. So what do I think of Cooler Master's Hyper 212 Evo? It performed well in the 87 watt testing, but failed in the 150 watt testing. So I would recommend this cooler shouldn't be paired with anything more than an 8-core CPU, and that is assuming that that 8-core CPU isn't being overclocked. Now the fan does get pretty loud at max RPM, but based off my testing, you really shouldn't need to run the fan at full speed. And for the price, the Hyper 212 Evo is a pretty good cooler for the lower count CPUs. An 8-core CPU is a lower core count CPU. Thanks AMD, good job. Now the only issue I have with this cooler is not really with this cooler, it's with Cooler Master having so many different CPU coolers using the Hyper 212 name. Now I understand like there is the Hyper 212 Evo or the LED, so they're not the exact same name, but they're still indicating the same lineup, and the coolers are different coolers. You can probably get 3 or 4 Celsius between some of these coolers. If you are looking to buy a Hyper 212, try to find a review for that specific cooler to then understand what to estimate or what to approximate that you should be getting with that cooler, because I do think some of these coolers are gonna have like 3 or 4 Celsius difference depending on what cooler it is. Well, that's all I got for this one. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're still watching, maybe hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified whenever I drop a new video. Please follow me on Twitter at HFG_YT. And as always, thank you for watching and see you next time.